Good morning. We are in Genesis 36 through 41. So we're reading about the story of Joseph. And Joseph's story is one of kind of like a lot of hills and valleys. If you've never read it or you're not familiar with the story, Joseph was the youngest son of a large family. He had a lot of brothers. They were essentially a blended family. But all of his brothers didn't really care for him because Joseph's father um, loved him the most. And so all of his brothers had a little bit of jealousy. And there were a couple of nights where Joseph had these dreams where he essentially was telling his brothers that, like, hey, one day you're all going to worship me, and or at least bow down to me. And his brothers didn't like that. They'd already didn't like him. And, one day they plotted to murder Joseph because they were outside of town, and Joseph went after them to, basically tell them to come home and just check in on him. And once the brothers saw Joseph, they're like, hey, let's take this opportunity to kill him. We want to get rid of this guy. And one of the brothers basically says, hey, instead of killing him, having the blood on our hands, why don't we just put him down in the cistern? And if you don't know what a cistern is, it's like an underground water tank. We still have them today, and depending on where you're at, you may know what that is. But he's like, we'll put him in the cistern. We'll leave him here to die. But his plan was to come back and rescue his brother. So anyway, instead of killing him, they decided to put him in the cistern. And right after they put him in, these tradesmen are passing by, and they're on their way to Egypt. So the brothers decide, hey, instead of leaving him in here, why don't we sell him into slavery? And that way we can make a little bit of money. We'll just tell dad that he was killed by some wild beast in the wilderness, and everything will be fine. So what they do is they take Joseph's robe. And if you ever heard of the movie Joseph in the Technicolor Raincoat or whatever, I think that's what the show's called. That's essentially what it's talking about. This robe was like, it was made from many colors, and it was like this really nice piece of clothing that was made just for Joseph. So anyways, they brought this back, they covered it in lamb's blood, and told the dad that, hey, sorry, but Joseph was killed. um, Meanwhile, the other brother went back to the cistern to try to find him, Joseph, and he was gone. But that's a little side note. So, anyways, Joseph's brought to Egypt and is sold into slavery under the Pharaoh's head guard, essentially, and he's kind of like his assistant. But God had blessed Joseph, even though he's in this terrible position, to basically everything go well for him. And over the years, everything Joseph does is done well, and he kind of gains favor as he continues his service of slavery to the Pharaoh. And what happens is that the Pharaoh's wife, I'm sorry, the head guard, I think that's his name, like his title, the head guard or whatever, his wife decides she wants to sleep with Joseph. And Joseph's like, no, I can't do that. I'm in control of all of this. The one thing I can't have is you, plus that would betray God. Well, eventually she says, hey, if you don't sleep with me, I'm just going to tell everybody that you tried to assault me. And so that's what she did. He fled the room. She grabbed his cloak, and then she basically told everybody, look, I got his cloak. He was trying to assault me, but I scared him off, and everybody believed her. So Joseph gets put in prison. And so again, Joseph went from being the youngest brother with brothers that didn't care for him, they wanted to murder him, to being sold into slavery. And now he's in prison. And while he's in prison, again, God finds favor in him and says, hey, I'm gonna entrust. The warden says, I'm gonna entrust you to overlook all of the prisoners. So at this point, Joseph's basically running the prison. And while he's there, Pharaoh sends his cupbearer and his head baker to the prison. And during this time, they both have some weird dreams. And Joseph, they ask Joseph, like, what do these dreams mean? Joseph says, only God can tell you that, but let me hear your dreams. And he knows what these dreams mean. The cupbearer, Joseph tells him, like, hey, in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to pull you out of prison. You're going to resume your position. The baker tells him his dream, and Joseph says, bad news, you're going to be executed by a pike, and that's going to happen in 3 days also. And, Joseph told the cupbearer, hey, when you get back to Pharaoh, just let him know who I am. And let him know I told you this, basically saying, like, maybe it'll help me get out of here, right? So 3 days passes. The cupbearer goes back to the Pharaoh. He pulls him back as his cupbearer, and then the baker gets impaled. We don't really find out why exactly they were in prison, other than it says they offended the Pharaoh. Anyway, the cupbearer forgets to tell Pharaoh about Joseph, and some years had passed, and Joseph's still in prison. But at a certain point, Pharaoh has a dream, and then another dream, and he's like, these are really weird. It has something to do with like 7 fatted cows and 7 skinny cows, and then the cows eat the fatted cows, and then same thing, like 7 heads of wheat that all look great, and then 7 that are all docile. So he searches Egypt to find all the wise men and anybody that can tell him what these dreams mean. And at that moment, the cupbearer says, oh, I remember. I was supposed to tell you something. I can't believe I forgot. There's this guy named Joseph. He's in prison. He was able to tell me my dreams. Maybe he can help you. So he does. The Pharaoh goes and talks to Joseph, and Joseph tells him, like, hey, what that means is that Egypt's going to have 7 years of prosperity. And then it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. So you need to store up 5/7 of everything you produce over the next 7 years so that Egypt can survive. And Pharaoh was so pleased with what he told him, he pulled him out of prison and basically made Joseph his right-hand man. During this time, Joseph then oversaw the cultivation of all the grain and storage of it, and to the point where there was so much that they just stopped counting. I'm now at the point where the famine has hit, and I've heard this story many times in church. I've never actually read it, but what we're leading into is that Joseph's brothers are going to come ask him for some grain, not knowing it's Joseph they're coming to ask for. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. But after kind of explaining the story, I want to talk about, like, what does that mean for us today in 2025? The story of Joseph. So what I'm getting out of this is that no matter how bad your situation is, how dire your situation is, how loved you are by others, like Joseph's father just absolutely loved him because he had him in old age and he didn't think he was going to have any more kids, and he was given Joseph, and because of that, he just adored him. But at the same time, he was extremely hated. He was hated by his brothers, right? To the point of being murdered, sold into slavery. The tradesmen, doing their thing, they just disregard the fact that this was a human life and sold him as a slave. The guardsmen that the head guard or whatever who brought him in saw favor of him. He just completely gave everything over to Joseph. At the same time, that guy's wife completely ruined Joseph, even though he did nothing wrong, and now he's back in prison. Back to the point where Pharaoh, he's back in the head of the whole country of Egypt. So his hills and valleys are so big and so shallow. So deep that the one thing that was constant though was his faith in God and God's favor in him. And so when we look at our own lives, when we're in our own hills and valleys, how do we look at God? Do we look at God with a consistent and constant level of faith? Or do we have more faith when things are going good and less faith when things are going bad? Or I think this is actually more of us. We have a lot more faith when things are bad because we need God more. And when things are going good, we have less faith because we feel like we don't need him. We've replaced him with things like money or comfort. And so I think the point of the story is that, hey, be consistent in your faith with God, and he will be consistent in his faith with you, as he always is. But we have to be able to be open to him speaking to us in order to hear him. And if we do that, if we're steady in our faith, then he will find favor of us in us, and he will bless our lives, no matter what comforts we have, relationships we have, regardless of our earthly stand. God is always with us and can use us for his will. So that's kind of my interpretation of the story of Joseph so far. Again, there's some really cool things coming up in the next couple of chapters here, but we'll talk about those tomorrow. So hope you guys are having a good day. Make sure you're reading your Bibles, and if you stuck with me this long, Great job. Leave a comment. I'd love to chat with you. Thanks.